Alright, so here's a question for you. What do you think has defined all the different metas in HSR? Some of you might immediately start thinking about the different types of damage, right? Like during 1.0, all the characters were mostly attack-based. During 2.0, during the break meta, there was a lot of break effect focused characters. And right now, everyone seems to be HP scaling. Or maybe you'll think about the team comps that the characters are actually played in, like for example, it was the hypercarry meta, or it was the dot meta. But in my opinion, there's actually one thing, or rather one role, that's often overlooked as the defining factor for the different metas that have happened across the game's lifespan, and also for different player accounts as a whole. Personally, I think it's actually pretty different from the common stuff you'd normally think of, because in my eyes, it's actually the sustains that define the meta rather than any one damage type or the team comps they're played in, or even one specific support. What really got me thinking about this was looking back on the previous banners that have happened in HSR. Basically, I was trying to figure out when exactly I had rolled for different characters and kinda try to make a timeline for my account. Originally, I was just kinda looking to have an idea of like, oh yeah, that's when I was playing Fei Zhao, or back then that's when attack scaling Jingliu was good. But what actually really caught my eye while looking back at all the different banners of the various meta DPS and broken support units is that filtered throughout all the different banners were the sustains that I was also rolling on to make those aforementioned characters actually, function. So today, what I want to do is discuss the role those sustains have had for my account and also kind of explore the value they've had throughout the time that HSR has been out. So let's talk about it. To start, obviously I do think it goes without saying that more recently there has actually been a standout sustain character with Hyacine, but let's be real here, she's less of just a sustain and more of every role all in one. I guess that's just the perk of being a remembrance character and probably the most broken character in the entire game. Despite that, I think all the previous sustains, and even Dan Heng who recently released, have always been there in the background doing a whole lot of stuff without getting too much credit for it. Like, let's go back and take a look at the 1.x sustains. Apart from the standard 5-star characters which are Bailu and Gepard, we also had 3 4-stars with Natasha, Lynx, and Preservation March, as well as the free Preservation Trailblazer. There were also 3 different limited sustains that were released with Luocha, Fujuan, and Huohuo. And to put it lightly, at least back then we weren't exactly hurting for choice. I mean, I still remember getting my max difficulty clear of World 6 of the Simulated Universe with a full fire team using the Preservation MC. I also remember getting Huohuo after not originally planning to for my Jingliu, and I definitely remember getting my first ever 10-star clear of MOC after I got Fujuan when she released. But in all those cases, those units were basically the afterthought. Like back then, at least in my eyes, it wasn't the Preservation MC that was what enabled me to get that World 6 clear, it was my Himiko and my Acid doing the brunt of the work. It also wasn't my Huohuo making my Jingliu better, it was just the fact that for her time, Jingliu was the outright best DPS in the game. Even for Fujuan, I didn't really consider her the difference maker for getting that max star clear because at the end of the day, she was just a replacement for my Natasha who to this day is still level 60 and pretty much unbuilt.
And I've got to say in all honesty, it's the biggest piece of dog shit.
Do you get what I mean? Like, those characters have basically never really been considered to be the difference maker for characters getting clears and whatnot, yet they're always present there in your team doing something and providing different things that are extremely useful, yet easy to go unnoticed. I mean, let's be real here, no one looks at an MOC 12 clear and goes, man, I can't believe my Adventurine carried that run.
Are you winning, son?
Oh, Doctor, you're huge.
Huh?
But if you really look at it, they are always there doing a lot regardless. Like the break that my Preservation MC was providing back then was actually invaluable for helping my team survive by taking away Kekolia's turns. My Huohuo funneling energy into Jingliu to give her extra turns in her enhanced state made a massive difference for my account that didn't have Bronya at the time. And my Fujuan providing missing stats and a ton of survivability let me push into different content that someone like Natasha simply wouldn't have been able to get into. With all that said, really, it wasn't until I sat there and looked back that I actually realized all that. I mean, sure, some of it was due to not knowing as much about the game back in 1.x, but also even now I wouldn't consider myself too different from the average gamer. So if I didn't really realize it, then who's to say that anyone else did? It wasn't just the 1.x sustains though. I mean, even going into 2.x we had 3 sustains enter the game that while very good, still weren't considered the big dogs or meta defining. We had Gallagher released as a 4-star who was basically entirely overlooked if you didn't have E2 and then relegated to just part of the team if you did, because he ended up being heavily overshadowed compared to the likes of Firefly, Ron May, and the HMC for those teams. I mean, hell, when the break meta was starting out, I still remember seeing some clears running characters like Natasha and getting clears with her. After Gallagher, Aventurine was released, who entirely changed the landscape of sustains by essentially making your different teams unkillable. But with that said, I mean, it's not like it was super easy to die before then, so all in all, he didn't end up actually changing a whole lot and was actually very replaceable. Personally, in my case, I didn't even get the guy until his rerun in 2.6, so that was basically an entire meta that I skipped over with no issues despite not having him. Which I guess goes to show how broken sustains were even back then. Later, and lastly, we had Lynx's release closer to the end of the 2.x patch cycle, who was basically a better Gallagher and once again pretty much made it impossible to die, while also providing different options for the player to run them as a damage dealer rather than just another sustain. And as mentioned earlier, during 3.x we've had 2 sustains released now that Dan Hang is out, with Hyacine being the other one. As a whole, with those 2 characters being in the game now, I would say this is probably the first time that the public has looked at and then accepted a sustain to be one of the most meta-defining units. I mean, it says enough that Hyacine is part of the current wheelchair, let alone what she's actually doing in it. The whole time though, again, these units were always there doing something specific, and it's actually something that I called out in part all the way back during Aventurine's time in the meta literally over a year ago, and also during the power creep fiasco around the time that Sunday released. And that's the ability to just keep your team alive with pretty much no cost to you, while also being extremely easy to use. In short, what I called out back then was a 2-part thing. For one, it was that shields as a concept were too strong and honestly don't really fit into HSR's gameplay loop. I mean, when you have a character acting out a turn like Aventurine does to replenish your shields through his follow-ups, you basically don't ever have to think or consider whether or not your team would actually be dying, or even getting to low HP for that matter. But also, the other thing I called out was that kits were becoming too bloated. Like, when you have characters that can do it all, then that can result in the game scaling up around them to match that growth and power, and for better or for worse, both of those things actually ended up being emblematic of the current state of sustains in the game. For example, on one hand, you've got Hyacine, the do-it-all pink girl supported by the Aeon of Veracity. She's flexible due to her speed and that she can be SP positive if you need her to be, she heals a metric ton, she buffs the team in a variety of ways, mitigates damage, and on top of all that, she deals a ton of damage too. Or, in short, she does way too much for just one character. On the other hand, you've got the recently released Dan Hang, who's the new Aventurine. He's got extremely strong shields, acts out of turn through attaching his dragon to one target, and on top of all that, he can also attach a buff, and even enables an interesting interaction through pairing with Sunday due to the aforementioned dragon. Basically, each of these 2 characters show exactly what I talked about all that time ago, yet up until this point, at least personally, I don't think it was ever really at the forefront of people's minds. Like, when you think of Hyacine or Dan Hang, you're like, yeah, those are banger characters that do a ton for my account. But when you look back at the older sustains like your Fujuans or your Gallaghers or even your Aventurines, for the most part you just look at them as just a sustain, even though for their time they were actually doing just as much as Hyacine and Dan are now. In truth though, recognizing all this on its own and realizing the impact that sustains have had over the course of the game isn't actually that big of a deal. Right, like, okay, Dan Hang and Hyacine do a ton of stuff right now, and Fujuan and Aventurine did a lot back then. But so what? Well, in my opinion, this all actually results in one thing that has gone relatively unnoticed during the HP scaling meta, and that's that the damage dealt to us is going up at a very rapid pace. Right, like I'm sure most of us have at least one of the HP scaling characters, whether that's a newer favorite like Evernight, or maybe the anniversary character Castoris, or even one of the buffed characters like Jingliu or Blade. For the teams that those characters are played in, there is a massive unspoken quality of life that you don't see too much in the other teams nowadays. And what I mean by that is what I mentioned just a bit ago. They're basically unkillable. If you remember though, I said earlier in this same video that being unkillable is something that hasn't really been an issue for a very long time now. Whether that was with Gepard in 1.0, or Fujuan in 1.3, or Aventurine in 2.1, or the newbies that have released since, dying hasn't ever really been a problem for the current state of the meta as long as you have at least one of those units. But what about the older units after new ones are released? Like, if you go back to an older comp, for example the 2.5 follow-up comp with Aventurine, you'll find that it's actually much harder to passively keep your team alive than it was back then. You know your Aventurine that used to be able to keep your team up with the shields that he gave from just his follow-ups? Well, it's pretty much not possible to sustain off of just that anymore. You have to actually use your skill now. What about Gallagher then? Well, try taking him into the new endgame anomaly arbitration and see if you can survive for more than a couple minutes. See, something I noticed while looking back on all this is that it is very easy to just kind of not notice or ignore all this if you're someone that has been playing or using the sustains that are currently part of the meta, but that doesn't mean it's not happening or the game isn't becoming more difficult in the background. And it's definitely something that I've noticed has repeatedly happened as the meta has developed over the course of the game, and particularly in 3.x with the HP meta giving everyone tons upon tons of HP to work with. So in short, the so what is that it's actually become significantly harder to sustain your teams if you're someone that doesn't have the newer Aegis sustains. And while that may not have been the case in 1.x, I would argue that it was definitely the case in 2.x when we saw monsters like the Banana Monkey as well as the Sam Boss shilling shields, and it's even more the case now in 3.x when we're fighting monsters that not only deal a lot more damage, but also can take multiple actions that results in you really wanting to have a damage mitigator like Hyacinth. Really, my point with all this is that the game is becoming more difficult on a fundamental level simply because the damage we take is constantly rising to combat the amount of sustain that each of the newer units can do. And my concern with this is that the older options that we had available aren't really working as well as they did in the past, not to mention how they should be working in general. Remember, your Aventurine from back in 2.1 costs the exact same amount of rolls as your Hyacinth does now. But let's be honest, it's a pretty obvious choice as to which one is better and also which one you'd rather have on your account if you had to pick between the two of them. Here's a hint, it is definitely not the Gambler. Obviously, yeah, there are some caveats to this. I mean, we just got Dan for free, and characters have been buffed in the past. So technically, I guess it's not something we really need to be concerned about because both of those things can happen again in the future to mitigate the problems that can come about from the overall damage increasing. There also are ways around needing a really good sustain. I mean, take a look at Finon. He was ran in a sustainless team comp prior to Dan Hang's release, and even now it's arguable whether or not Dan Hang is actually an upgrade for him. Yet another example is Archer. He just does so much damage that someone like Gallagher is actually great for him purely because he can help with SP upkeep. I mean, you don't really need to sustain if the enemy is dead, right? But with all that said, what I'm mostly concerned about is honestly just how fun it is to actually deal with for the players without the current sustains, or for those that are trying to brute force with raw damage. I mean, let's be real here, are you gonna sit there for hours on end resetting Anomaly Arbitration for the one run where your team with Gallagher doesn't get nuked? Probably not, which means you're pretty heavily incentivized to both have and build those newer units. I also do worry that it really just won't be feasible long term for those older sustains to continue to be usable like they are now. Like, don't get me wrong, you can still clear content with Aventurine, Gallagher, and Lingsha, but it's undoubtedly more difficult, and that begs the question, will you be able to do the same in 4.x? Right? Like, think about how busted Hyacinth is right now. What's gonna happen to your account if you have her during 4.x and she starts feeling like Aventurine does right now? It makes me concerned that there is actually a world where Hyacinth does fall off one day, because she literally is the character that can do everything all at once. So what this means is that if they want to sell another sustain in the future, they're either going to have to do more than she does, which is crazy on its own, or they're going to have to ramp up the difficulty and damage to the point where somehow she won't be able to sustain enough anymore. But hopefully it just never comes to that, and we can all continue to use our current characters, and hey, maybe they do finally announce the second round of buffs for the older ones. Even now, I don't think we necessarily need to be all up in arms about the damage rising, but it has been something on my mind recently, and it's definitely something worth keeping an eye on as we continue to go forward, especially so into 4.x. All in all, I really just wanted to talk about this to bring it to light that all this time, sustains have kind of been what has defined the different metas the game has had, and also are really the backbone of what makes or breaks your clears throughout the game. Honestly, at this point, we shouldn't just be calling the game Honkai Support Rail in my opinion, but also Honkai Sustain Rail too. It is kind of funny how it still lines up with HSR too, huh? Anyway, that's all my thoughts, and I appreciate you listening if you made it this far. If you have some thoughts of your own on this topic, I would love to hear about it, so feel free to leave a comment down below or join my Discord link down in the description to talk with me about it. As usual, thank you so much for watching, subscribe, and if you haven't already, maybe give my other videos a shot too.